We're Mechina students of Or Sameach, and we have a special J-Sam from Australia. I want to welcome both groups of people here, primarily because there was some scheduling conflict. I couldn't be in two places at the same time, so instead I just combined the two places into a single group. And at least for the J-Sam, the Australian guys, this is already, I think, the fourth Q&A session that we've had. So you might all be questioned out, but again, I welcome your questions. As I always say, I cannot guarantee an answer, but feel free to ask whatever you want to ask. So, yeah.
Rabbi, I was wondering what culpability modern-day Germans have for the Holocaust perpetrated by their dads and granddads, and more generally, Eastern European nations that helped them out.
Right. So the issue is Germans. Now Holocaust, and of course, you are correct in noting that when we assign moral blame for the Holocaust, we are not simply looking at the Germans. Most of the death camps were located in Poland. So there were many Poles who were involved. Many Poles also saved Jews, but many Poles were actively involved. Ukrainians, Hungarians. And the question becomes, how do we look at intergenerational guilt? Is there a notion of a nation being guilty of a moral offense, so every member of the nation shares that culpability, or is there a notion that each person is judged as an individual? So the truth of the matter is, in the Torah itself, there's an interesting contradiction to this point. In the Ten Commandments, it does say, God visits the sins of the fathers onto the sons. There is a notion of collective guilt. And yet, we have another verse in the Torah itself that says, parents do not die for the sin of children, nor do children die for the sin of their parents. Each person dies or is accountable for their own sin. So we seem to have two different ideas here. One is the notion of a nation as a collectivity, or at least a family or a nation as a collectivity, and the other is each person is judged as an individual. The Talmud itself asks that this is a contradiction, and the Talmud says the following resolution. If the child endorses, validates, supports the activity of what the parent or the predecessor did, they are considered to be post-mortem complicitors in this act. So the difference would be that if you have, for example, a neo-Nazi, even if he's not actively involved in Nazism, but he endorses, he validates, he believes that what they did was correct, then spiritually he is considered to be a participant in those crimes. If he disassociates himself and repudiates, and that is done with sincerity, then we believe he can do tshuva, he can repent, and he would no longer be considered to be negative. Now, it's interesting, maybe less so today, but I remember in the 1960s, if you went to Netanya, we went north, different places, you would actually see a lot of German college students, non-Jews, who were working in the beaches or the forests or the parks or whatever it would be. And I was told that in Germany there was almost a kind of penance ritual, that many of the descendants of perpetrators of the Holocaust felt they needed an atonement by coming to Israel and working for the Jewish state. And they felt that somehow this would create an atonement for the atrocities of the past. As you know, the Germans made reparations available to this very day, and many of the buses in Israel were purchased with that German money, or they were received from Mercedes-Benz and the like. And there was a big argument in the Jewish community for many, many years. Should we accept reparations from the Germans? There were those who considered that blood money, that, you murder 6 million Jews and then you want to kind of wipe the slate clean by giving us money. Others saw this as a gesture of reconciliation, forgiveness, not so much forgiveness for the evildoers, but forgiveness between nations. So it's an open question. I'm not going to take a definitive view on that. But all I can say is that according to our sages, if a later generation repudiates the evil of its predecessors, they are not tainted with that evil. So I think it is legitimate to, in fact, in a way, you shouldn't even use the phrase "forgive the Germans," because what's really going on is the new generation has nothing for which they need to be forgiven, because they have disassociated themselves from that past. But it is a good question, thank you, and it's still a painful question to this very day. Okay, anything else? Yeah.
Let's say we visited the mayor, Shiva,
Mm.
and one of the things we were discussing is that many of the guys that study there full time, and their wives were. Why would it not be the opposite, or why can't it be the opposite, that the woman studies full time and the man works?
Yeah, so the question is, why can't you have a circumstance? Why is it always the man studies full time and the woman works? Why can't you have the woman studying full time and the man works? Well, first of all, the truth of the matter is, no matter what configuration you have, a woman's work is literally never done. Meaning you'll never have a situation where a woman will be exempt because there'll be children in the house, etc., and the woman gives birth to the children and raises the children. So in a way, that's almost not workable. But again, from a technical standpoint, let me point out the following, just to give you a little perspective here. When a Jewish man marries a Jewish woman, he takes on certain obligations. And these obligations are spelled out in a document that is signed by witnesses called the Kesuvah. You've heard of the Kesuvah. That is the Jewish marriage contract. And among these obligations is, I, as a Jewish husband, have a halachic obligation to support my wife. I am obligated to support my wife. That is what I agree to in the Kesuvah. Now, immediately you might ask the question, so wait a second. So how could there ever be an arrangement where the husband learns and the wife supports the family if the Ketuvah says the husband must support his wife? Answer: monetary obligations can be modified or changed by mutual agreement. And a wife, out of the goodness of her heart, might say that the importance of the study of Torah is so phenomenally great that I am willing to waive my entitlement to support, to enable my husband to study Torah, because that will bring holiness to the house. The point I'm making is this: if a man is able to learn full time, it is only out of the kindness of his wife allowing him to do so. She does not have an obligation to do it. She has an absolute right to demand he go to work, because that is the obligation of the Ketuvah. And that does mean, therefore, a husband whose wife is the primary breadwinner must have enormous gratitude and appreciation to his spouse for letting him do this, because according to the halacha, she does not have to let him do it. It is out of the kindness and goodness of her heart, because she understands that it's an overarching good in bringing a lot of Torah into the house. Now, technically, the mitzvah of Torah study is in fact a mitzvah on the man. It's not a mitzvah on the woman. So for a woman to learn all day might be a nice thing, but it wouldn't have the spiritual value of the man learning all day, because this is the role that God has assigned. So therefore the idea is this: under the strict halachic model, a wife has the right to tell her husband, it is your obligation to support me. However, if she understands that a full-time Torah content will elevate the spiritual level of the house, she has the right to waive her right of support and encourage. And that is what the Kollel lifestyle is based on. Now, I'm very happy that you saw the Mir Yeshiva. It must have been a real eye-opening experience. There are people who stay in Kollel for the first year of a marriage, the first 2 years, the first 3 years, the first 5 years. And then there are people who literally, maybe not that many, but in Israel you'll find quite a few, who actually stay in Kollel their entire lives. That this is the life that they've decided to have. And that is a great thing, that is a wonderful thing, but it is conditional on your wife being happy with it, on your wife understanding that this is a beautiful thing. If it makes your wife bitter, unhappy, if the children are suffering, then you have to fulfill your obligation under the Ketuvah, and Kollel is not the right life decision for you. Now, there's nothing wrong with being poor if a person is happy being poor. Meaning, people who are happy in a very, very simple lifestyle. They don't seek more. They don't want more. These are righteous and holy people. We don't have to push them to earn more money. There is nothing intrinsically valuable in earning more money if you're happy with less money. Pirkei Avos says, who is a wealthy person? A person who is happy with his lot. So there are poor people who are happy in life, and there are millionaires who are embittered in life. So I don't have to look at a poor person and say, you got to get a job, you got to make a living. If they're happy that way and they're growing spiritually, that's fine. But where I am concerned is that where that type of lifestyle is generating unhappiness, bitterness, depression, despair, and breakup of relationships, it then becomes poisonous. And at that point, you need to revert back to the more standard idea of the husband supporting his wife with dignity. Okay, so that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question. Yeah?
To what extent is that obligation therefore? Meaning, let's say the husband does work and has a normal job and even a part-time job, and she's still not fulfilled with the amount of money coming in, how much more does the husband have to do to reach this obligation?
Well, the husband does not have to work 70 hours a week. Basically, if a husband has one full-time job, he has met his obligation. And then, unfortunately, the nature of modern economy is such that you often have to have a two-income family. So at that point, you don't have much of a choice. I mean, you've done as much as you're expected to do. And then whatever needs to be made up has to be made up in whatever way you can make it up. You certainly should not feel that you're derelict in your responsibility because you haven't been able to get a higher paying job. But all I'm saying is you can't use this as an excuse not to work. You have to work, and then you try to make ends meet. You know, this idea that almost every family in America, Jewish, not Jewish, religious, not religious, is primarily a two-income family, is a relatively more recent phenomenon in at least American society. I mean, when I was growing up, it was still common that you had like one breadwinner and generally a stay-at-home mom. Right? If you remember the old situation comedies of the 50s and 60s, Father Knows Best and Ozzie and Harriet, these were the family-friendly TV shows. The concept is mom stayed home and made cookies and this and that and wore pearls, so leave it to Beaver, you know, whatever it would be. For whatever reason, and it's still not entirely clear, somehow life became more expensive. Somehow people couldn't make it anymore. And therefore people had to go out and work. Women had to go out and work outside of the home. And even that's not enough in many cases. And the question becomes, what impact does that have on children when children are put in daycare centers or children are put with babysitters and they're not put with their mothers? And by the way, that is actually an issue with Kollel as well. It's an issue that people discuss because there is a cost-benefit calculus that's a little more complicated than people make it. And that is, on one hand, for the husband to learn is tremendous, beautiful. But that means the wife has to work. But if the wife has to work, what happens with the kids? So some types of jobs can be done out of home. But even then, even if it's a job out of home, the kids are not going to be, paid attention to in the fullest way. So when you analyze the Kollel issue and the Kollel decision, you also have to ask, what is the impact on the children by their mother not being as available to them as she otherwise would be? It's a hard question. It may very well be that the benefits of Kollel are so great that they even override that. But it is a trade-off. That's the problem. The problem is sometimes we portray these things as easy choices. Oh, for sure, the good choice is this. The problem is it's not between good and bad. It's between good and better or bad and less bad. It's kind of the lesser of two evils because there are going to be costs on both sides of the equation. And that's something that a family has to think about very carefully. Yeah.
My question kind of relates to breaking Shabbos or breaking any halacha in specific situations. But let's say, for example, you find yourself in the Negev and you've missed your last bus. promised your grandmother that you would come and you'd help change her, external bladder or whatever, and you have a map on you, but it's pitch black, so you have to walk back, and she can't call anyone, so you have a flashlight. Can you turn it on to go help grandma? If you don't help her, she's going to suffer immensely. She won't die, so it's not a situation for Kuach Nefesh.
Yeah.
But, prevent immense suffering. Could you break halacha? Could you break Shabbos?
Yeah. So you're posing a really, really difficult question. Essentially, you're giving me a hypothetical where if you don't break Shabbos, there's going to be hardship, pain, and suffering, but nobody's going to die. Well, first of all, let me point out, in the real world, you're allowed to make an assumption that this might be a life-threatening situation. I mean, so you'll have some wiggle room. But you're asking me theoretically. Let's assume that you knew for a certainty that grandma's not going to die. She'll just have an absolutely miserable, painful, excruciating experience, but she will survive. Am I allowed to desecrate Shabbos in order to avoid her going through that type of situation? So this is interesting. Technically, if it's not a matter of life and death, you got to keep Shabbos. Now, there are ways out, and let me explain this. The laws of Shabbos have many technicalities that you might call loopholes, but they are technicalities within the halachic system. Among them is a concept called shinoi. Shinoi means if you do a forbidden activity in Shabbos in an unusual manner. So, for example, you dial your cell phone with your knuckle instead of using your fingertips. So that downgrades the offense from a biblical offense to a rabbinic offense. Now, many say that even though you cannot violate a Torah law unless it's a matter of life and death, some will permit you to violate a rabbinic law in order to spare great suffering, even if it's not a life and death situation. So if you assume that the rabbinic law could be violated, and then you could do your malacha through a shinoi, so that might be a way out of this. Now again, not everybody agrees that even rabbinic laws could be violated that way, but there is ground for that. And I think in your grandmother's situation, or your hypothetical situation, I would also consider that to be almost a pikuach nefesh anyway. So, because you could imagine a lot of things. The worry itself could give her a heart attack. Many different things could happen under those circumstances. Longshoreman is not a Jewish career that much. You don't find that many Jewish longshoremen. But there were two ports in Europe in the beginning of the 20th century in which all the longshoremen were Jewish. One was Salonika in Greece, which were Sephardic Jews, and the other was Königsberg in Germany on the North Sea, which was Ashkenazic Jews. Now, a port's busiest day is Saturday. For whatever reason, ships come in Saturday. They have to be loaded and unloaded. The port of Salonika was the only port in Europe that was closed on Shabbos because the Sephardim refused to work. They were righteous. They just refused to do their job on Shabbos. Nobody else could take their place. The Ashkenazim were less religious, and the Ashkenazic longshoremen desecrated Shabbos. They violated Shabbos. So it is said that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter went down to the harbor, went down to the ports, and he instructed the longshoremen how they could do every activity with a shinoi. So instead of it being a Torah violation, it could be a rabbinic violation. He actually invested the time in downgrading them, and he thought it was worthwhile. Someone could have had the attitude, hey, they're violating Shabbos anyway, so to hell with them. Who cares about what they're doing? He actually felt it was worthwhile to convert it into a lesser prohibition. But as I say, that is would be my suggestion for that particular issue. Yes.
So if the path towards building a stronger relationship with God is through Torah learning.
Say again, I didn't hear
The
you.
path to reaching a stronger connection with God is
Yes.
predominantly through Torah learning.
Yeah.
How do women reach a connection with God? Can it be as significant as men's? It's not.
Yeah, so this is a very excellent question. I had just mentioned a minute ago that the mitzvah of Torah learning is not a mitzvah for women, and yet we are told that Torah learning is the strongest way that we have a connection with God. So women who don't have the mitzvah of Torah learning, Does that mean that they cannot have a connection with God that is equal to that of men? And or what is the way that they create that connection? So there are a few different answers to that. Answer number one is that even if Torah learning is not mandatory for women, it is certainly permissible and in many cases encouraged, so as a result they can get some of that connection to God through Torah learning. Number two, the Gemara in Brachos says that a woman gets her connection through Torah learning by the support, emotional and cooking or whatever it is, that she gives to her husband and children, that she creates the atmosphere that enables them to be successful in their learning. She becomes a co-equal partner in that learning, and therefore whatever spiritual connection to God her husband and children have is her spiritual connection as well by virtue of her contribution. And number three, it is said that a woman's primary channel to God is not necessarily through the intellectual vehicle of Torah learning, but through her faith in the Almighty and her trust in the Almighty. There are many, many sources, and of course I'm generalizing, people don't like generalizations, that women are much greater in faith and trust in the Almighty than men. That's why women did not commit the sin of the golden calf. That is why women did not commit the sin of the spies who lacked faith in God. So as a result, a woman's connection to God does not require necessarily the intellectual work of Torah learning, because it resides in her heart and in the simplicity of faith. In fact, there's even an idea sometimes that when you make your connection to God too dependent on cerebral activity, that might undermine the simple emunah of the heart. So men who don't have the emunah of the heart need to try to get it by the brain. Women have it in their heart. And if they have it in their heart, they don't need to go further than that. It's there already. God is already there, so to speak. It doesn't have to be discovered by the laborious process of Torah learning. So those are kind of the three answers. One is a woman does have access to Torah learning. Number two, a woman supports her husband and children in the study of Torah. And number three, a woman has the direct access of her faith and trust in the Almighty that's already in her heart.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on other sects or strains of Judaism, such as Reform and Conservative, that had no division between men and women, sure?
Well, okay, so what are my thoughts about conservative reform, which are basically egalitarian? I mean, there are many other things, but one of their most noticeable features is the egalitarianism and the notion that there is no separation of roles between women and men. First, conservative reform, and for our purposes, I'm not going to differentiate the movements that much, although there are some differences. They have done some good in the Jewish world. I'm not going to deny. For example, the Reform movement has created a focus on social justice and taking care of the poor, which is something that the Orthodox, we've done it, but it should be in our radar in a stronger way. So I would give them credit for bringing those issues to the fore. They've also acted as a way station. Many people who have become religious went through transitional phases, and in that way, conservative reform have been way stations that perhaps kept people Jewishly identified so they could transition to true religion. So those are the two things I would give them credit for. On the other hand, there's a lot of perversity, a lot of falsehood. Again, I'm not saying anybody's evil. That's not the vocabulary I'm using. But for whatever the reason, by mistake or whatever, many, many ideas of Judaism have been distorted, have been contaminated, have been misrepresented. So egalitarianism, I think, is a good example of this. You know, if you want to make the claim, men and women are equally beloved by God, men and women each have equal access to a relationship with God, I would say 1,000% that is absolutely true. Men and women stand before God with equality. But here's the problem. Equality is not the same as sameness. Identity of value is not the same as identity of function. The idea that because women are just as beloved by God as men, which is something that I, of course, agree with, does not mean everything a man does, a woman does, and everything a woman does, a man does. In many, many ways, for a woman to say, I could achieve my fulfillment only if I can do whatever a man does, is an insult to women. Because essentially a woman is saying, perfection is what the male does, and I gotta be like the man in order to be perfected. I mean, on a simple level, women can have babies, men cannot. I mean, meaning the concept is, men and women are different. They're different not just biologically, they are different psychologically, they are different spiritually, they function differently, and their functions in the world are different. That doesn't mean one is better than the other. God forbid. Equal dignity, equal respect. The world needs men and women. The world does not need women who are behaving like men or men that are behaving like women. Now today, in this day and age, with not just gay and lesbian, but with transgender, these distinctions are getting blurred and confused. And that's really, really unfortunate. Gender dysphoria is a reality, and there are people who are genuinely ill, and one has to deal with them with compassion. Again, I'm not here to put down any one individual. There are people who suffer tremendously from this. But overall, it should not blind us to the reality that God did create fundamentally men and women. And a man is not just a woman with male genitalia, and a woman is not just a man without male genitalia. They are two different spiritual entities. And the notion, and this is where I think the conservative reformer are going up the wrong tree, the notion that equality of dignity means they have to be the same in all ways is really a mistake, and it's a denigration of a woman's uniqueness. By the way, even in the feminist movement, this has come to be recognized. There is what is called post-feminism or second stage feminism. First stage feminism was trying to make women kind of like men. Everything men do, women can do as well, etc. Second stage feminism said, hey, why are we trying to be like men? Let's celebrate that which is unique and special and different about women. And by the way, there are men's groups that are doing the same thing on the part of men. They get together, they beat a drum. Okay, some of it's crazy, but there are actually Jewish religious groups that are into that as well, how a man can become a better husband if he's in touch with his emotions, his inner child. Oh, okay, these are different movements in psychology or pop psychology, but they do have some religious value as well. There was a movement, the Call of the Shofar, that was trying to do a lot of this, and I know people who went to it and they said that their lives were transformed. So the point basically is that instead of making everything a cholent, men, women, mixed up, everybody's the same. There are even parents, this is mamish, a crime against humanity. I mean, these parents ought to be arrested. They're raising their children, they have a baby. They're raising their children, what is it, non-binary. They don't want to raise their child as either a man or a woman. Now the obvious question is, well, what is the kid? They're not saying, they're keeping it whatever. But they say it is not for us to impose the artificial construct of gender on a baby. What's it called? Non-binary baby or something like that. That's a crime. It's quite literally a crime against humanity. It's one thing if Nebuch, somebody is struggling with this, but this is a kid who could have been raised a boy, could have been raised a girl. Everything would have been fine. The parents said, we're not going to raise him either way. There is frankly a sickness in the world over egalitarianism run amok, in which there's no sense of things having distinctions anymore, which are quite, in fact, there's a guy who made a documentary, What is a Woman? I don't know if you came across it. So, whatever, it's not, I mean, unless you're particularly interested in this, I'm not saying it's necessarily a wise use of time, but he's interviewing academics and intellectuals and gender studies professors. What is a woman? And, well, a woman is whoever says she's a woman. No, well, whoever says they are a woman is a woman. There's no definition. So he asked back, like almost as a yeshiva education, But what is she saying she is? I mean, you can't say, whoever says they're a woman are a woman, when they say, I am a woman, what do they mean by that? So the professor says, are you being hostile here? You know, whatever. I sense a microaggression. So the end of the show, he simply asks his wife is making cookies in the kitchen, he says, what is a woman? She looks at him like he's crazy and says, it's an adult girl. And that's kind of the end of it. So simple things get so confused. And therefore, to go back to this is a very long-winded answer, the problem with conservative and reform, in that one sense, is that they are confusing equality of dignity with sameness of function. And that is not the case. By the way, there was a famous book on feminism written by a social psychologist in Harvard University, Carol Gilligan, who died a few years ago. It was called A Different Voice. And she wanted to show at a very early age, boys and girls see the world very differently. This is very fascinating. I want to mention this. She gave a bunch of kids a test. It's kind of similar to your question in a sense. What if you have a child and your child is dying of an illness and the only medicine that could save his life is in this drugstore, and this drugstore is closed for the night? What do you do to save your child? So every boy that was asked the question, these are like 5-year-olds, said you take a rock, you smash the window, and you take the medicine. Now that actually is a good answer. I'd be pikuach nefesh. When the girls were asked the question, all the girls also said, you know, if you have to smash the window, smash the window, but be sure to leave a note or tell the police ahead of time. Now, she was trying to say that the male way of thinking is to identify the most important issue and go for it. The woman has a greater intuitive sense of interrelationships and collateral consequences. Now that does mean, again I'm generalizing, that a man is better at laser-like focus of intensity, because a woman will be distracted because she's thinking about all of these other things. But the woman has a heightened sense of awareness of all of the interrelationships that exist. So, which is better? Well, by the way, that's why they say, you know, don't interrupt a man. Now that could be good and bad. The man is learning, don't interrupt, he's orangutan in learning. The man's watching a football game, don't stop him, right? That's why they say cooks, the great cooks in restaurants are often men, because a good cook is standing over the soup, stirring the same pot of soup for 6 hours. Only a man can do that. A woman has to answer the phone and do the laundry and everything else. So men are better, Professor Gilligan said, at laser focus and intensity. And women are better at multitasking, in the sense of looking at different things. By the way, the Zohar says this goes back to a mystical idea. A mystical idea. You know, one of the cliches that people say is, one of the differences between men and women is men hate to ask directions. Women love to ask directions. Baruch Hashem, we now have Waze, we now have GPS, so we don't have to ask directions anymore. But I know myself, when I would go on a trip with my wife, you know, we'd be in the driveway, she'd say, well, let's go stop and ask directions. I have to be lost at least 2 hours before, I break down eventually, but until I'm lost for 2 hours, I said, I will figure it out. Now, why is that so? Why is a man so reluctant to ask directions? Steht in the Zohar. Because first Hashem created Adam, and then he saw it was not good for man to be alone. He created Chava from Adam, right? Eve was born from Adam. So man's first moments on earth, which defines his essential identity, was aloneness. Man was born alone. Woman was born in a context of relationship. Chava never existed without Adam. Adam had a few minutes without Chava. So for a man, my essential identity is bound up with autonomy, control, not needing other people. If I need other people, that's a threat. For a woman, needing other people, connecting to other people, is not a danger because that is her nature. She was born into a world of relationships. One might even speculate that that's one of the reasons why only men count for a minyan and not women. Because what is minyan? A man relishes the idea that I'm in control. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to create one institution where no matter how great you are, you can't do it alone. A minyan is you're forced to need other people. A woman doesn't need that limud, that learning, because that is already intuitive. And we find in many areas that the halacha makes certain institutions available for those that have a spiritual lack that has to be addressed. Right, so there's a lot of things to talk about in this area, but I'll take another question. Yeah?
You could say as well that we have individuals in this world, women who might be born with masculine traits and men with feminine.
Yep.
So if there are spiritual institutions aiming to help uplift men who struggle to be together, what would you say for a woman who struggles to be together when institutions are there for her?
Yes, so the truth of the matter is you do have to understand, you're 100% correct, that when I discuss the male attribute and the female attribute, they never occur in unmixed, pure ways. Every man will have aspects of the feminine within him, and every woman will have aspects of the male. The hope would be that in a woman, the female would predominate with some male input, and with a man would be the opposite. That would be the hope, or at least when you're not dealing with gender dysphoria or the like. But the truth of the matter is, within the religious world, we do see more and more opportunities that for women who are very intellectually gifted, that there are avenues for them to explore advanced Torah study. There are very fine books that are written by female scholars of Torah. Some of it might be in the more modern part of Orthodoxy, but even within the more traditional right wing, call it the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world, you see that women are making contributions of intellectual depth. So I think there is an understanding, and this has been endorsed by our Gedolim, that women, just as men, have a diversity of talent, and talent should not be squelched. They should find some expression, and there's more and more avenues of that expression. So I think we do recognize that we don't simply lock people up in the kitchen and say, bake cookies and have babies and that's it. We do recognize there should be avenues there. Yeah.
With like the emphasis that Judaism puts on like celebrating individuals and that type of play, why is there such an effort within the writing community to look so similar?
Yeah, that's a good question. The issue of looking the same is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. If you look at photographs from the great yeshivos of Europe prior to World War II, people were poor, so they didn't have fancy wardrobes, but you can see different types of shirts that they wore, different types of ties. People wore blue shirts, not just white shirts. In fact, even when I was in yeshiva in the 1970s, we would sometimes wear a blue shirt on Shabbos. Today would be unheard of. In fact, I saw pictures of suits that I wore at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. I cannot believe it to this day. There's no way on earth that I would ever wear anything like that, like plaid and loud. It was just unbelievable. So standards have changed. Even in my lifetime, it's changed a lot. I would really say that it's not as important as people make it out to be. It's a superficial issue. But there is some importance in wearing the team uniform. Even gangs, the Crits and the Bloods, right? You wear the wrong uniform. So there is a concept that when you live in a world where people are choosing sides, you want to kind of identify which side you stand up with. It's a way of team affiliation. Again, I don't want to put great spiritual importance on it, but I think it has psychological importance because it makes me feel part of a group, because otherwise I'm a beleaguered minority of one, and that kind of saps my energy. This way, I'm part of the team. That's one idea. The other idea is that as society itself becomes much more degenerate in terms of dress and the like, so sometimes there'll be a counter-reaction, meaning to say, the way we combat excesses is by going in the other direction. Now, maybe that's an overreaction. That may be the case as well. But you can understand that at a time when society itself was relatively modest and chaste, so I could dress like regular society and that wouldn't be a big deal. But when society goes to the other extreme, I need to overcompensate. So that's where I would think the notion of similarity of dress comes in. Yeah.
How can we understand the relationship of Chassidim to their Rebbes?
The relationship of Chassidim to their Rebbes. It's a little bit difficult. Now, do keep in mind that Chassidim embraces a huge number of people and number of movements. And there are many, many different Rebbes, and the relationship is not going to be uniform in all of them. In some, the relationship of a Chassid to a Rebbe might just be similar to the relationship any of us would have to a revered rabbi or scholar, meaning it's not a magical, supernatural thing, but this is my teacher, this is the one that gives me inspiration, I look up to him as a role model, and that would be perfectly fine, right? I'm simply looking to this person as my rabbi, as my teacher, as my guide, as my role model. So on that level, there's not much difference between Chassidim and Rebbe and a non-Chassid to his Rosh Yeshiva or his even shul rabbi if he has a close relationship to his rabbi. But you are correct that among many, many Chassidim, Chabad might be a very, very good example. The Lubavitcher Rebbe has been gone already for more than 25 years, but the particular relationship that many Chassidim have to their Rebbe is way, way beyond, he's a role model and an inspiration. It almost becomes a deification. And in some extreme cases, crosses over to a deification. And all I can say is that I think it is somewhat dangerous, meaning to say Judaism, the clearest basic teaching of Judaism is there's a difference between man and God. That's basically it. There's God and there's man, and man is in the image of God, and God breathed into man a divine soul, but man is not God. So what I think basically happened was that I think that over time, Rebbe worship becomes almost conflated with idolatry, and then you have some problems. But I will tell you that psychologically, I do understand it. And again, I'll use Chabad as an example, because the Rebbe did so much, not only for his Chassidim, but so much for the Jewish people. And when there's gratitude, and there's admiration, and there's awe, it can slide into worship. And that's where maybe the line is crossed in an improper way. But the truth is, I can walk hand by hand with a Chabad person until you cross that line, because I myself have a tremendous admiration for the Lubavitcher Rebbe as a person. Just phenomenal. But as I say, I can walk up to a certain point, but then I think that you're crossing beyond the boundary. So I can't fully justify it. Yeah, yes.
What is the root cause of the spiritual malady of excessive fear of punishment, and what is its cure?
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. What is the root cause of the malady called excessive fear of punishment? That's what you said? Yeah. Well, okay. So first of all, the point is this. The notion that fear of punishment is bad or it's a malaise is lav dafka true. We do believe that God will hold us accountable for our misdeeds. We do believe that. There is a concept of not only reward, but there's a concept of punishment, because God is a God of mercy, but that mercy is combined with justice, and therefore there is going to be accountability. So fear of punishment is regarded as an inferior motivator, but a legitimate motivator. It's something that can motivate me. I better behave. Listen, even with our parents that way. Gee, I better get home before 6 or Dad's going to get real upset. That's fear of punishment, whatever it would be. Either I'll be grounded or whatever the case is going to be. So fear of punishment is not a bad thing in and of itself. I think it is a motivator. Where it becomes bad, though, is, number one, where it distorts your relationship to God. When you no longer see God as loving, compassionate, caring, you see God as abusive and mean and cruel, and you're scared of him as opposed to revering him, then it becomes dysfunctional, then it becomes a pathology. Because God is not, God forbid, abusive and cruel. God is loving and compassionate, but punishment is one of the tools that he uses to motivate us to go in right ways. So all I can say is that if you have the fear of punishment, but it's not combined with a sense of God's love and God's compassion, and then you view God as an object to be scared of because of his abusive, unpredictable character, that is actually a sickness. That is a sickness. Perhaps it's not technically a mental illness, but it's approaching mental illness because of that distortion. So because of this, maybe we've overcompensated. By that I mean the following. I mean, I'll be frank. There are speakers in the Jewish world, I'm not going to mention them by name, who are popular in many, many circles, and they talk quite a lot about fear of punishment. They talk about hell. They talk about torture. They talk about damnation, and they have their audiences. I guess some people are masochists. They want to hear this stuff. Now you'll notice that most of our Torah speakers do not talk about that. I don't talk about it that much. Now, what's going on? Is it because I deny there is such a phenomenon? No, I admit there's such a phenomenon. But because people who overemphasize this take away the love, take away the compassion, take away the fact that everything God does is for a higher good, then maybe we're overcompensating by not emphasizing that aspect of life at all, which might be a little bit of a mistake. But I think many Gedolim have said that in our generation, we are so weak and we are so inhibited and we get scared and frightened so easily that these are aspects that should not be emphasized for our generation, because we need to be secure in God's love and not focus on the negative. That doesn't mean there isn't a negative, but it means I have to focus on what will position me to have the best relationship with God that I can have. And many have concluded, many great rabbis have concluded, that does mean that certain aspects are not going to be overemphasized at certain times. That's kind of the overall point. Yeah.
I've noticed that a lot of observant Jews drink caffeine, drink coffee,
Yeah.
some smoke.
Yeah.
A lot of them eat sugar. I'm sure you know, if you've ever had coffee or a cigarette, that they're definitely psychoactive substances that really change your perception of the world. How do you then draw the line between something like caffeine, which kind of falls into the generally accepted category of drugs that no one bats an eyelid about, and things like cannabis, amphetamines, etc.? Like, where's the distinction, and why is it?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So you're taking the question in a little bit of a different direction than I thought. I thought you were going to raise the general health concerns with caffeine, with salts, with sugar, which are dietary issues, etc., health issues, and those are issues as well, in which we are frankly guilty, and all of us, I obviously include myself, should be more conscious about this, because there is a mitzvah to take care of our bodies and take care of our health. But your issue is going off in a little bit of a different direction. Your issue is the psychedelic, mood-altering nature of these substances. Caffeine can give me a rush, and now people even have Red Bull, have these energy drinks that kind of, they want to do their 24-hour marathon or their 48-hour marathons or whatever it would be. And we do that, right? People take caffeine, people drink Red Bull, even cigarettes, putting aside the health issue, but just the nicotine rush itself. So the question is, well, if you're allowed to kind of enhance your mood, increase your energy by stimulants, so why can't I go for the bigger ones, right? Why can't I go for cannabis, for marijuana, and the like? It is a good question, and now that these things are recorded, I have to be a little more reticent than I used to be. I've been on record as saying that in terms of basic principle, it is probable that the moderate use of marijuana does not raise a significant halachic problem. And that's why we find in the United States the progressive legalization of marijuana, and even the OU gives a OU hechsher on marijuana brownies. Now, they were criticized for it, and they say, well, we're just supervising the ingredients, we're not supervising the marijuana use in and of itself. But I think the bottom line is, and this is always, people question this type of argument, but it's the argument that's called the slippery slope, meaning to say, if you're telling me, Rabbi, I smoke one marijuana cigarette a week before Shabbos, and it really, really, really improves my Shabbos, and that's what I do one marijuana cigarette a week, you're not going to go to hell for that, okay, okay. But the problem is the nature of these drugs is addictions build on themselves, and you're opening yourself up to a very, very dangerous type of precedent. This is called the slippery slope argument. Once you start going down that hill, you slip. And that's really what I think the real problem with marijuana is. It's not the sporadic recreational use, which may even have some benefits, maybe, but it is what it leads to, and it can lead to a real path of destruction. So as a result, I think we ought to be a little less experimenting in these things, because there are consequences. Do you remember LSD? I guess LSD, I don't know if it's still around, but in the 60s, LSD. So there was a professor at Harvard University, Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a professor at Harvard. He must have been a smart guy, right? And he discovered the potential in LSD for spiritual enlightenment and all sorts of. And basically, he became a pothead. The last 25 years of his life, he was like totally destroyed. So here you have an example of a brilliant person who saw the potential in psychedelic drugs, and yet those psychedelic drugs just destroyed him. Basically, made him crazy. So there's nothing intrinsically wrong with occasional use, but you got to worry about where it leads to. Yeah.
Just to follow up, it sounds like what you're effectively advocating is moderation to the extent that one can be moderate in use.
I think so, yeah.
So would that same principle apply to what we consider to be harder drugs, like, for example, ecstasy? Let's use that as an example.
Well, I don't want to get in more trouble than I've already gotten into. But I think there's a very big difference. I basically think that moderation is virtually impossible for hardcore drugs. The addictive power is so great and so intense and so immediate that you're not going to be able. That's totally unsustainable. Marijuana potentially can be sustained in moderation. The other drugs absolutely cannot. So I would say you have to have a zero tolerance for that. Just the consequences are too devastating, and the addiction is too powerful. Yeah.
I want to push the line of caffeine just a little bit more as an example.
Yeah.
It's often seen as a non-issue, but then it becomes something that people seemingly can't live without or have every day for a very long period of time. And I want to try and, is it not possible that we're then missing something in life, that we're potentially always, I'm going to use the word high of caffeine, always stimmed up, running around doing things that can never really relax, maybe affecting our sleep, maybe affecting our schedule, etc.
That's a very, very interesting point. We just take caffeine for granted. We don't look at it as a drug, although it is a drug. And we have our coffee, and I can't function until I have my coffee, and then whatever it is, many times during the day. Number one, as a general rule, a Jew, maybe a person, should never become addicted to something that they absolutely have to have. In fact, one might even try as a thought experiment to wean themselves off even harmless addictions, by saying, I'm going to go with caffeine for a week or whatever it is. I think that's a good character builder anyway. And number two, I think you have an excellent point. What is it that I have to be fired up about all the time? Is there an emptiness in my life? I know people have applied this, not so much to caffeine, but I've heard it to social media addiction, where people have to be on Twitter, people have to be on Facebook, people have to be connected, people have to text, like every second. And that's because they can't be with themselves. You're in a car, I have to listen to the radio, I have to text, I have to do something. Because somehow being with myself is so painful, because I feel a void or an emptiness in my life. This is where I think something like kosher meditation can help a person. Mindfulness, to live in the moment, to see the beauty of your life in this particular moment. So I think you do have an excellent point, that maybe even something that we don't make a big deal about, like caffeine, might be symptomatic of some spiritual malaise. It's a very excellent point. Yeah.
So I was wondering, based on the concept, you might be misremembering this concept, that the Jews were sent into, one of the reasons the Jews were sent into exile was to gather wisdom from the nations that was forgotten to us. Is there anything that you think might be wisdom in modern 21st secular society that Torah society has forgotten or needs to get?
Well, I'm not sure has forgotten. I mean, I think we have all the wisdom, but on the other hand, there are secular thinkers who have been able to articulate in a more modern idiom some fundamental ideas that maybe we would not always see in the Torah, although it's there. I mean, I think of people, I'll give you one example, Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey is a Mormon, and he wrote a book, he wrote a few books, but 7 Habits of What Highly Efficient People, one of those books. And that is actually a book on character building. You can read that book for spiritual values, although it's written in the context of how to do well in business. But he addresses personality, he addresses character, he addresses what we call midos, interpersonal relationships. So there are people out there are thinkers out there who kind of give us structures, how we relate to people, how we understand ourselves. So I think there's a lot of insight in psychology, in sociology, in marriage counseling, in different types of therapies that can help us have real insight in how to become a better person. And when you become a better person, you're closer to God. So I think that's valuable. Now, the problem is you have to know how to separate the wheat from the chaff. That's going to be always the challenge. There's a lot of stuff there that we would not consider part of a Jewish framework, but there's a lot of stuff that's there. There was a great, great rabbi who was an expert in ethical development, Rabbi Volba, Rav Shlomo Volba. You may have heard of him. He died a few years ago. He was in Switzerland during World War II. Switzerland was a neutral country, so he managed to escape from Poland to Switzerland. And while he was there, he wanted an apprenticeship with Jean Piaget. Those of you that have taken psychology in college know that Jean Piaget was the world's expert on the moral development of conscience in children. How do children develop a sense of right and wrong? Now, he was a guy, he was not Jewish, but since Rav Volba was so much interested in the ethical development of character, he wanted to learn from Piaget how children pick up a sense of right and wrong. Now, that's a classic example of going to a totally secular source and trying to get insight in how we can become better people by tracing the process of moral development. So this is an example. So I think there's quite a lot that's there. And listen, I mean, sometimes we make a mistake when we, sometimes the line of a yeshiva is, oh, everything out there is stupid, everything out there is treif, nobody has anything to tell you. It's not true. There is wisdom out there, but you need to be able to know what fits Judaism, what doesn't fit. And that's not so easy, but it can and it should be done at some point. Okay, I guess we're almost finished. Any final question before we break? Okay, thank you so much. Good seeing you, and take care.